Those of you who like details, who notice things, who listen carefully or who watch what's happening on the screen, who pick out the details of what's happening in the background on these Zoom calls, who maybe notice what kind of books are on the shelves or what kind of toys are placed around or what kind of vinyl is being listened to in the background, will notice that I keep holding on to and mentioning a book. Now this book, as I keep saying, is, and you might guess, the Bible. But that word Bible comes from the word for a library. And that's because this is not a book. This is a collection of books. A collection of books we call the Bible. There are hundreds of stories in here. But at the same time, it is a big story. A story about a God and his people and his creation. And the largest part of that story is a Jewish story. And the root identity part of that story for Jewish people, I would argue, is in a story called Exodus, where their God rescues the Jewish people who at this point are in slavery to the Pharaoh and the Egyptian Empire. Their God rescues them and then they wander for 50 days, 7 weeks, until they come to a mountain, Mount Sinai. And there, their leader, a man called Moses, goes up to God, just like you do. And he speaks to God, and God speaks back, speaks to Moses, gives him words to say to the whole nation, talks to the whole nation. And this is the only time recorded in any history in the world where a God speaks to a whole nation. And God on that mountain says, remember what I did in Egypt. I rescued you. That's the kind of God I am. And then God says, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, and that word covenant means a deep binding promise. And so you've heard an if there. Actually quite rare in these stories. And you probably expect that when a God says if, what they are going to say is, if you do what I command, then I'm going to save you. But this God has turned things completely around. Instead, he says, remember how I already saved you. That's what I do. I'm the God who hears the cry of the oppressed and who acts. I've saved you. That part is done. Now you're saved. I've got something for you to do. You see, the Jewish story didn't start in slavery. God's creation project in these stories didn't start with a man called Moses. It didn't just start with a man called Abraham, although the Jewish story started there. And what God promised to Abraham in a book called Genesis is that Abraham's descendants would be, among other things, a kingdom of priests. A kingdom of priests and a blessing to all nations. Let's think about priests for a minute. I don't know what your idea of priests or clergy or vicars or ministers or pastors are. But I have been part of lots of groups of all different kinds of clergy. And sometimes that's amazing and sometimes that is pretty terrible. There are times when you can get lots of clergy together. One is a tour. There are tours in all different places that are specifically designed for all different kinds of priests and ministers. Sometimes I can't imagine anything worse. Who needs more priests, you might ask? Well, let's think a little bit about the ancient world and about what priests actually did in those times. In those times when people were talking about all sorts of different gods, the priest and the temple were the places that God was put on show. If you wanted to know what a god was like, you went to the temple, and the way the priests acted helped you to see what that God was like. Also, the priests helped you to connect with that God. This story is about God whose project and whose promise is that he is going to bless his world. And things may go wrong. In fact, they go wrong all the time in this collection of stories. That's what makes it ring true. But this God says this project is going to move forward, and it's going to move forward through human beings. This God tells his people that they were saved for a reason. Not just to be a cosy club of those who've made it, but he has made them to be partners. Right at the start of his story, his creation project, he took a man and he asked him to help him name the animals. And God didn't need any help to name the animals, but he invited human beings to do that. In the Exodus story, God says to Moses, when you go to Pharaoh, you're going to be like God to Pharaoh. A Jewish teacher, a rabbi called Paul, is inspired to say that God's people are living stones and that they are the body of the Messiah, God acting in the world, the body of Christ. This is the kind of work that this God has invited, has made his people to do. Not to sit around being happy to be in the club, but to be a blessing. I like to talk about this community, God's community of people, being a blessing machine. A machine has a purpose. It's made for a reason. And what God is doing is blessing the world, putting things back together. Imagine for a minute a machine like a digger. It can look so great. In a showroom, at a farm show, at some sort of exhibition, it can look shiny, immaculate, everything painted the way it's supposed to be, no scratches or anything. But is that what a digger is made for? No, a digger is a tool. A digger is made to get rusty, to get dirty in doing what? In tearing things down and building things up and preparing the ground, in being made and used for the purpose it was designed for. And God says to his people on that mountain and all the way through these stories, you will be for me a blessing. You are for me a kingdom of priests, living stones. You exist to move the project forward, to be my partners for the benefit of those around you and the creation around you. And I keep reminding people that there are no benefits to being part of this community, to joining the church. Instead, there are responsibilities. There are privileges. There is a job to do. It's not something you have to do. It's something you get to do. You get to change the world, to fix, to mend, to heal, to love, to bring justice, to channel God's grace. And every single one of us, as God's children, have a part to play that no one else in the machine can play. So that means we need each other and we need everyone. The invitation is there. The call, the challenge is there. Let's join in, let's join together as we respond to this challenge.